Hello, Joe. How are you?
I'm good. How you doing, Ian?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. How is Portland at the moment?
Well, all the city you can see from your house. It's okay. It's not as bad as people are making it out to be. Everyone's
Hmm.
making it out to be like it's a war zone, but everything is confined to certain areas.
Hmm.
Commerce goes on, so it's all right.
Given that you do have something of a track record of walking around war zones, I presume that you have been spending quite a lot of time sort of mooching around the streets, having a look at what's going on.
Actually, not. I mean, like you, I'm doing promo for a book, so I'm spending a lot of time doing promo. These things start at like 11 o'clock at night. I mean, the actual, what you would say is action or whatever it is. But 11 o'clock at night at my age, you know, it's not the place for an older guy anymore. I've been down there a couple of times. And observed, but it's not something I haven't seen elsewhere in a way. And I think I'm more interested in thinking about it than seeing things like that at this point.
Yeah. Is there anything in Portland's history that sort of indicates this? Is it a more sort of radical political city in terms of its heritage than I was aware of?
I'd say on the other, it's sort of the opposite. This used to be a KKK state. Very, it had a lot of laws that kept people of color out. Had a lot of redlining, so you couldn't, black people couldn't buy housing in certain areas. It has a history of racism. Actually, it's one of the whitest states there is. So, we have it's sort of a mixed bag in a way, because Portland is known for being quite left of center. And that's sort of true, but in that kind of white way where it's comfortable to be left of center. You're not often confronting real issues and thinking about things because they're actually there in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, it has a leftist tradition, but in that kind of mealy-mouthed liberal way.
I'm very familiar with that way. Yes.
Yeah.
Let's talk. I mean, I sort of wanted to ask about your origin story. It's obviously particularly interesting to me. I'm a guy that really likes comics, but I'm a political journalist, and you're working in an area which does not have a lot of competition. Let's put it that way. Of comics journalism, but you actually started as a journalist, right? Before deciding to go over to dedicate yourself to comics.
Yeah, I mean, I studied journalism. I wanted to be a hard news writer, but I can say I never really performed that function as I had envisioned it. I thought I was going to, be out there reporting stories, filing every day, that whole thing. But every journalism job it seemed I got was on publications that were really advertiser driven. And it was so clear that I should be writing articles about those who are advertising. I mean, almost literally, the ad guy would drop a business card on my desk and say, that guy bought an ad, you probably should write an article about it.
Oh, wow.
So quite soon I saw that journalism is commerce. And it was so disheartening to me that I kind of just dropped out of it and fell back on something I knew as a kid, which was drawing. And, I went through this whole period of doing rock posters and album covers, living in Berlin, sort of doing this whole thing and trying to make a living at comics, or anyway, trying to get my foot in the door because I like doing comics. It's something I never stopped doing since I was, 7 or 8 years old, but I never thought of it as a profession. Eventually, just I think because, if you're getting into journalism, you care about the world, political things interest you. And so I gravitated toward a very political subject like the Middle East and the Palestinian situation, and went there, had a look around, and it sort of became, I wanted to do comics about that experience. I didn't really know what I was doing, but the journalism blood just started kicking in.
Mm-hmm.
And I began behaving as a journalist when I was there. And I realized, okay, I'm putting something together here. I don't know quite what. Over time, I sort of understand a little more what I'm doing, but that first impulse was very organic and didn't have a lot of theory behind it.
What did your there's a thing that constantly gets brought up in Palestine, where I think sort of 2 or 3 times people, after they tell you their story, sort of look at you and say, what is the point of talking to you? You know, what does it change? Were you telling them that you were writing a comic about it? Because I would have thought at that period in that place, that would have been the most preposterous notion for them to have taken on board. Did you say it was a comic?
I used to introduce myself as doing a journalistic project. Mm-hmm. It was preposterous to my ears as well. In some ways, I won't say it still is, but at some point I realized they actually had a tradition there with a cartoonist named Najil al-Ali, and he was a very revered cartoonist who did a lot of political work. He was actually assassinated in London in the 80s, and it's never been quite clear who did it. But he went after everyone. He went after the Israeli government. He went after the Palestinian leadership. He was really interested in what the person on the street was feeling and suffering. And so any enemy of that person, he was against. And so his work is so revered that when I finally really began to broach what I was doing, they said, "Oh yeah, like we have this cartoonist," and so people like that open doors for you. They never will know it. They never would have imagined it, but they opened doors.
And so there was a heritage there to sort of draw from.
That's right, exactly.
Because then what's interesting is comparing that to, so your latest book, Paying the Land, there's a point where someone actually gets quite cross with you for doing comics about the thing and said, well, it shouldn't be a comic because this is a serious business. So actually, even now, it's still a controversial proposition for lots of the people that you're doing interviews with.
It is, and I think for some people it is. However, I usually bring work with me to show people. And I made 2 trips up to the Northwest Territories to do that book. And on the second trip, I actually had some drawings to show. And that's when it really clicked. People like seeing their lives depicted. And they're happy to tell you what's right and what's wrong about pictures you're drawing. And so, they get it. People got it. Mostly they get it. In a case like that, there are always cases like that, where people don't like the notion or think it's just for kids or whatever, but that's because they've had no experience with it. I think at this point, it's a lot easier.
I noticed sort of when you're sort of doing lots of your journalistic work for journalistic publications, Time Magazine, New York Times, it sounded like you had sort of a fraught relationship with sort of editorial at a lot of these places, not necessarily those. There's one story, I don't know if you need to tell the story. Did the New York Times complain about the cross-hatching on one of your drawings because it looked like a crucifix or something?
Yeah. I mean, that was one of those cases where they hadn't really done comics. This was the New York Times Sunday magazine, and it was journalism. It wasn't just some fiction, which, fiction, you can kind of leave it. But nonfiction has to be proof, copy checked, that whole process. And so how do you copy check drawing? Do you know what I mean? So there were a lot of editors looking over my shoulder, maybe more than needed to be. And in that particular case, they were looking at literally my cross-hatching and thinking, what are all these crucifixes on the wall of a Muslim person in Gaza? What are you trying to suggest here? And it was like, those aren't crucifixes. But that's typical. I've always had, you're right, I've had a fraught relationship with the mainstream. But some of that is kind of my problem too, because sometimes you find yourself trying to hammer yourself into those shapes that you think they expect. And so it's not always the editors. Sometimes you kind of, you mold yourself into a Time reporter, you don't let yourself go in a way. So some of that is my problem, let's say that, or it was in those days anyway.
I've read a thing where you were quite self-critical about, I think there was a piece on Hebron in Time Magazine, which I don't know if this is still the case. You thought was your worst sort of act of your worst sort of journalistic piece. For what it's worth, I thought it was very good. I understood you. I know you didn't like the sort of probably the degree of balance that you'd shown in that piece towards sort of Israeli settlers on the one hand and people in the city, Palestinians in the city. But what was quite striking about that piece is in the first few panels, you do things that one would want to see in a current affairs magazine, of giving a sort of vivid sense of life to a scene. In this case, because it's very rainy, very muddy. You find out that the Israeli soldiers go away and lots of Palestinians find it easier to make a particular journey. But also at one point you use a piece of language which stayed with me, which you said, let's face it, and then talked about how difficult it would be for Israeli settlers in a city like that. And let's face it is a very informal way of talking. It's a way that you would mostly avoid in most journalistic practice. But actually in this capacity, it helped to sort of inform the reader about the sort of psychological reality of what's going on there. I mean, does comics have something to bring in that capacity, that sort of ramshackle informality of comics that allows you to speak in that sort of way to sort of prize open ideas?
I think that's true. People expect something else from a comic. They do expect something a little edgier, maybe a little, the way I think about it, and I hope I transmit this through the work, something a little more subversive. Comics have that, and it depends on what comics you've grown up on. Like I've grown up on underground comics. If you've grown up on underground comics and on something like Viz in Britain, you have this sort of sense of what they can go and that they can push the boundaries a little further. But then it also depends on what you've been reading. And a big influence for me was Hunter S. Thompson and his informality, not just informality, but there's a sort of zaniness about it. It didn't mean the subject matter itself wasn't very serious, because I think if you read Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, that's a great book about.
It's an amazing book.
Yeah, it's an amazing book about the American political process. And you can tell he really knows the process well. He knows that stuff deeply, and he cares enough about it that you actually feel moved. He's so upset. You feel you're moved by this. You realize it's a genuine thing. He's not just trying to muss your hair up and say, look how nutty this all is. It matters to him. And so there's that. In other words, you can have it in prose, but definitely comics, people expect something else, I think. And I think if you formalize comics too much, if you have too many rules about their grammar, I think you begin to calcify them a little. And I always try to just keep those shackles off as much as possible.
You said once that comics are adamant. The comic medium is adamant. What did you mean by that?
I can't remember now. What I meant by that. I think it's, drawings are insistent somehow. There's a subjectivity about drawings that you cannot pretend to be objective when you have drawings. All drawings are subjective. There's this ultimate tension in doing journalism through comics, because on the one hand, the quotes, all that stuff, to me has to be correct, has to adhere to certain standards. The drawings, on the other hand, can go to different places, can sort of work as counterpoint with that seriousness somehow, or with that feeling of objectivity. Now we're in a subjective moment with drawing. And so I think they're more, it's pronounced more in someone's head, I think, with the reader's head.
What's your what's the technique with this stuff? I noticed the faces in your work seem extremely specific. I presume that the person really does look. I mean, each face is very, very distinct from the other in expression, in the sort of structure of it. Are you taking sort of photos? Are you sort of drawing them out as you're talking to people?
It's photos. I mean, as much as I know everyone does it differently. I know cartoonists who will draw people and draw scenes, and they start conversations that way. But to me, I'm really formally trained in a way as a journalist. So I introduce myself, I sit down, I turn on my recording device, or I take notes. So I'm not thinking in terms of the person's face until I'll just ask, can I take a photograph? So I use photos for reference. But if you read my transcripts of my interviews, I'm often asking very visual questions that would be very unusual for a prose writer to ask. If someone said, well, we were held in a school, that might be enough for a prose writer. But for me, it's like, well, what was the school? What did it look like? Can I get photos of the school? How are you sitting? I mean, all those questions you'll see in my work, because you need that visual information. And so I ask a lot of those questions, but then for people's faces, I just ask for a photo.
You mentioned earlier this Hunter S. Thompson. What's interesting there is, I mean, he's obviously very famous for putting himself in the work. And that's something that you've done throughout, although noticeably less so actually in your latest book. It feels like there's something quite interesting about that in the notion of objectivity in journalism. We have a situation right now in this country. There's a guy called Dominic Cummings, who's the right-hand man of the Prime Minister. And in many ways, arguably more politically important than the Prime Minister. But when he gives quotes to journalists, it usually comes from a Downing Street source. That's the way it's framed, which is actually quite a deceptive thing for a reader, because the reader isn't really given the information about the source in a way that would inform the sort of the incentives and the real politics behind the situation in order to assess that information. By putting yourself in it, something quite odd happens in your work, which is that this whole secondary layer of journalism, in other words, how did I get this information, actually becomes center stage in the work. I mean, you have certain moments where there's these almost tour guides, especially around Palestine, that will just take you to wherever the Israeli soldiers have last burnt down an olive tree or something like that. Was this, I mean, did that process come through organically in the work? Was it something that you wanted to do? It seems very distinct from most of the journalism that I read.
Well, very organic. And I won't say accidental exactly, but I came out of a tradition of writing about my own situation, writing, stories about my own life, autobiography. So when I first decided to go to the Palestinian territories to see what was going on, I thought of my work as travelogue, where it would be my story there, like my experiences. That became journalistic, and I moved into more of a journalistic way of thinking about it. But there I had my character drawn in the strip because of the autobiographical, tendency. It wasn't really thought out. Over time, I'm really glad that's how I started out, because I think I do question the notion of objective journalism. And I think the character basically lets the reader know that you're seeing this through one person's eyes. And also you're seeing things through a person who is imperfect, who is negotiating situations. I want to show all that stuff. I'm very interested in the seams of journalism, because even when I studied journalism, I still remember graduating and not really knowing how it worked. I always thought foreign correspondents were these sort of gods that just knew everything. They had a great sense of what was going on. And then when you're actually in a situation, you realize you have a guide, you have a translator. They're not always, but there are many cases where they'll steer you in a certain direction, where they'll tell the person, oh, don't tell him this. I mean, I know enough. Maltese is sort of like Arabic, so sometimes you can hear someone say, you can hear what they're sort of saying about what you should or shouldn't say. So you realize a lot of things are manipulated. And I'm a little shocked that most journalists don't just admit it. They don't want to admit that how much they depend on other people. And I think it's important to show that sort of thing. Also, I think it's important to show your relationship with people from other places, and, to show that I'm a Westerner going into places like Gaza. I'm a Westerner going into indigenous communities in Canada. There are relationships that develop. There's sort of sometimes suspicions. All that brings certain things into relief. So why not show it? It actually could be informative.
I was trying to put a word on the kind of journalism you do in relation to the human. I mean, the thing that what you want to say is that you're telling the human stories. Your heart is clearly, I mean, throughout the work, with the downtrodden. And yet it's more than just the stories, isn't it? And that's something that seems specific about comics journalism, that actually it's almost sort of experiential. There's one section where you look at a guy in solitary confinement for a very long time, actually. And this is in Palestine, and the panels get smaller and smaller, and you get this sense of claustrophobia that comes from that experience. I'm struggling to think of any other medium of journalism that could communicate a sense of what it is like to experience the thing that they're experiencing. So it's not quite just telling stories, is it? It's actually giving the reader some sort of almost emotional, psychological idea of what it might be like to experience the things that are happening on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's sort of the artistic side. I mean, that's the art of comics, the art of any sort of creative process, really. But you just take advantage of what the medium can deliver. But I think you're totally right. In that particular scene, for example, yeah, I wanted to show this feeling that what it would be like to be forced into these confined places, and that can be reflected in the panels getting smaller and smaller. Now, that's not strictly journalism, is it? It's the words are the same, but you're bringing in something else to get a feeling across. Because I guess I find that even for myself, when I'm in the field hearing these stories, you know, I behave in sort of a clinical way. I mean, journalism is really about getting a story and getting it right and putting everything else to the side. But when you're drawing something, all the emotion has to come back. You cannot be so dispassionate. You're usually dispassionate in the field because otherwise, how are you going to get the story? You're talking to people who've been traumatized. And you want to be obviously careful with that, but you want to get the story. And that's sort of something you learn over time, how to tease things out without necessarily, well, let's say, damaging the person as little as possible. It's like a doctor somehow. So when you're drawing, suddenly it's like, okay, now we're on stage. Now you have to draw people, and that's like putting people on a set, and you have to inhabit them in a way. So what was this person feeling? You know, you shouldn't, I don't think journalism should be left, especially with art, when you're relating it to art, you've got to bring those things out. That's the advantage you have. You're not going to keep it dry on the page, as a lot of prose ends up being. I mean, if you read the New York Times, you read their depictions, you know, they're factually correct and everything, but they can be emotionally, they don't get to you in that same way, I think.
Do you, the format sort of seems almost frustrating to me with your works. I mean, and correct me if you think this is wrong. Because it is highly respectable comics work, the expectation is that it comes out in books. But actually, I feel a lot of the time that I would really quite value having this kind of journalism in news magazines more. And that actually actually Palestine did come out in single issues before it was put together as a book. And actually that feels almost, especially because a lot of it sort of feels like a bulletin or like, you know, like from our correspondent in, that actually it feels almost like the natural format for it is sort of, you know, 10, 15 pages at a time in a news magazine. Do you have that frustration with format as well? Or actually are you quite happy with it coming out, with it being usually something that someone will read in a quite lengthy book?
No, I actually share that frustration. I mean, the lengthy books are what basically helps give you a living. Because let's face it, over time, it's sort of, the graphic novel became, it's sort of a marketing thing in a way. It's easier for adults to buy things that look like books. I mean, I'm simplifying things here a little bit. I like the way those books look. I like the way I'm presenting those books, the whole thing. And sometimes I do think of my work as a book. For example, The Garage, the book I did about Bosnia, Eastern Bosnia, and the town of Garage.
Have you forgotten the name of your own book?
Pardon me?
Have you forgotten the name of your own book?
No, Safe Area Garage. I know. I remember. I thought of that as a book. Mm-hmm. You know, I thought of it as a complete book. When I was doing the Palestine series, there wasn't really that possibility. I thought of them as comics. But just in general, not necessarily about journalism, but just in general, I miss that throwaway feel. I miss feeling that you were doing these things that sort of flew a little under the radar, so that they weren't, you know, really, I found my voice, I think, because it flew under the radar as comics. If I had to enter the field now with books and all the stuff that goes with a book, I mean, it's a bit more exalted. and there's more at stake for a publisher, I would probably be a little more timid, perhaps. I don't know, you know. So I'm kind of glad that I got to experience that more of a throwaway feel to it, and I sort of miss it. Mm-hmm. Though I think you're right. There are magazines that now turn to forms of comics journalism. I mean, there are websites. Even The Guardian will put things up every now and then. There's a French magazine called 21, which sends out cartoonists to travel around and do 30-page stories. That's pretty long for a magazine piece. So little by little, you know, it's getting out there. But yeah, I've actually done a series of smaller pieces because I wanted that feeling too. I wanted that feeling of, okay, this is going to take me 4 months to do, 5 months to do, which for me is a short amount of time, and it's going to get out, you know. But there's stories I did, like stuff from Iraq, or stuff about migrants washing up in Malta, stuff about, you know, Chechen refugees that were shorter form, and I like doing that stuff too.
Yeah, the Chechen piece was particularly good, by the way. So Paying the Land, which is your new book, I mean, feels it. I mean, bear in mind, I've spent the last 2 weeks basically reading your entire life's work, so it's quite a, you know, I'm now thoroughly immersed in your brain. It's a very wistful piece. It feels very melancholy. I mean, this is about the First Nations in Canada. I'm wondering, first of all, I mean, it's hard to define. Maybe I should leave it to you to define, but it does seem like the entire notion of it is concerned with this idea of what is land. Is land something that we live within, or is it something that we almost commodify and parcel up and come up with legal instructions for and mortgages and wage rates to pay them? Two basically completely fundamentally different ways of looking at the world. And also, interestingly, therefore, something that doesn't necessarily really have an obvious solution to it. And maybe that's where the melancholy comes from. I don't know, is this part of the subject matter, that feeling, or is it sort of where you are in your life right now, the changed way in which you're looking at things?
Well, I'm changing the way I'm looking at things to some extent, but also it's just the subject, the people I met. It's clear that their situation is such that they have to think about land, resource extraction, all those sorts of things, and they have to think about their culture. They have basically been forced off the land to become wage labor. And what are the jobs? The jobs are resource extraction jobs, unless you want to go on the dole or get a government job for which you need some education. So the laboring class has only that to rely on, resource extraction jobs. So there's that tension. They know what resource extraction means to them, and they know they've been forced off their land and their culture is being damaged, but they have to, they're part of the capitalist world now. So it's their sort of calibrating what they have of themselves, what strengths they have from their own culture within the modern world. I mean, there were very few people you talk to, in fact, no one who really thinks you can go back to something living in tents on the land in the way they used to. People might want to spend more time on the land, connect to it in a much more a deeper way than they might have. So yeah, there's this tension. It's a melancholic sort of thing in a way. But I think people are realistic, but they want to capture something about what their strengths have been and use those things going forward, basically. And you're right. I mean, for me, it was actually a very revelatory book. Most journalism is somehow more cut and dried for me in a way. It's like, this thing happened on this date. These people are arguing over this land. Those things are really something I can get my head around as a journalist. It's very different when you go to a community that sees things in such a different way. I mean, I come from the background of John Locke, where, you know, you own land because you put your labor into it. Land is this, that, and the other thing. I mean, it's there to be parceled, owned. It's property. The indigenous people I met, the very fact that they say something like, the land owns us. So when we're signing a treaty, giving it away, surrendering it, all these legalistic terms, these formulations that the lawyers came up with so they would cede their land to the Canadian government. When they signed those things, they thought we never owned it to begin with. What's this? Okay, we think this is a friendship treaty. So, there's such a different way of thinking about things than the way I'm used to. And so it does make me question it. Like, what is it about that way of thinking that is useful to think about and useful for us to critique our own Western ways?
Well, you end the book on this note. I got the sense that you'd been really quite affected by the experience, where you were asking yourselves quite deep questions about Western society and why it is that we think the way that we do, and this sense of sort of yearning consumerism against the sort of ideas that you'd seen there. It seemed like you were quite sort of affected, quite changed by the experience.
I would like to think I've been changed by it, because it was a very affecting experience. You're absolutely right. I went in thinking it's going to be sort of cut and dry, that it's going to be monolithic, maybe, that, indigenous people against resource extraction. Then you realize how complicated it is. But I came away with thinking this wasn't just a book where you think, oh, it's some form of anthropology where you're studying in other people. I find it interesting that, in a way, sometimes when you go out and to see other people, the anthropology, it becomes an anthropology of your own society in a way, because you're beginning to see a contrast. You're beginning to see the reciprocity people in which they think about the land, which is very unusual, I think. I think we tend to separate ourselves, even if we love nature, or we love to hike, or whatever it is. It's where we go there and then we come back here and wow, we got some fresh air. It's very divorced. I suppose it comes from, really, when you want to come down to it, it comes down to Genesis, really. You shall have dominion over the land. You have dominion over all these animals, and you're kind of in charge.
Yeah, I noticed your art style, by the way, is fascinating throughout it. I noticed there's less sort of cartooning in the face, that it's a sort of more naturalistic piece of work. Again, is that where your style is going at this period, or is that because you thought that's what fitted the subject matter?
Well, I've thought that fitted the subject matter since the early pages of Palestine, which were much more caricature in nature. It does fit the subject matter, I think, but it's always difficult. This book was actually hard to draw, because as much as I try to draw naturalistically, and as much as maybe I'm more comfortable with it, it's difficult for me. I always have an eraser in my hand. It's not the way I want to draw. I want to draw cartoony. Mm-hmm. I want rubbery arms and legs. I want sweat drops flying all over the place.
You still do that to yourself, by the way. In the few moments where you appear in this book, out comes the sweat drops. And
I need that. I need some of that. So it's not the way I prefer to draw, to be honest. It's just what the work sort of necessitates.
The objects of capitalism in that book, sort of bottles of alcohol, PlayStations, machinery for oil, all look like they have this kind of sense of foreboding kind of threat to them. Whereas nature, the landscapes, there's a scene with just fish, and the fish look like these almost godlike, sort of beautiful, elegant objects. And to be honest, by the end of it, I was thinking, even though it's a more wistful book, it actually sort of oddly felt like one of the most radical sort of pieces of work that you'd done. It felt politically radical in the manner in which it was being done, as well as the kind of messages that you might get from it.
Well, that's really nice to hear. I really appreciate that, actually. It was actually the pleasure was drawing the especially the animals. That was a pleasure, and getting away from the machinery. Every now and then I thought, I guess I better draw another such and such a bulldozer. Let me look it up. Let me from this angle or that angle. Sometimes you do things that are necessary that you actually get tired of drawing. Mm-hmm. But, the work requires that. But the real pleasure was drawing the fish, was drawing the animals, and drawing landscape, because landscape's actually a character. You know, an editor, a good editor, one of the ones at the New York Times said, when you draw this, I'd like to think of the landscape as somehow as a character. And I thought, well, that's a really good way of putting it. And if it's ever a character, it's in the Northwest Territories.
Mm-hmm. Do you have more work planned? I mean, this is your first book for 10 years. Are we going to have to wait another 10 years before we read the next one, or are we going to get something more than that?
You know, it's funny. I actually did a lot of work. People say that, but it's like I was working the whole time. I did shorter pieces. But anyway, leave that to me. I'm working on my Rolling Stones book now. I should be working on a book of journalism, but it's actually a hard one. And my head has to be in the right place to work on it. It's a book about India and a riot that took place in India. And it's about democracy and violence and their relationship. Can
you tell us about the Rolling Stones book?
Yeah, I can tell you that it's a very hard one to define. But the way I define it is a complete synthesis of Western thought and experience told as a book about the Rolling Stones. That's sort of it.
What I resent about you is your lack of ambition. I think that's really where the problem is.
But I mean, I have to say this about the Rolling Stones book is it's just really, really fun to draw. Like I'm burning to get to the desk. I feel like I'm 7 years old drawing. Now, whether that's going to translate as a book that other people are going to enjoy or find get anything out of, I don't know. But the experience is really a great experience.
It sounds like you're making the most of your various lockdowns and
right.
Good stuff. Joe, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Ian, I really appreciate it too. Thank you.
Thanks, mate. Cheerio.
Right.